Hello everyone, and thanks very much for joining us. This is the first of 5 episodes that Energy UK is putting on Mission Possible, and it's the podcast series focusing on a lot of the government priorities and what's going on. My name is Sandy Kelly. I'm the Vice Chair of the Young Energy Professionals Forum, and we're going to focus today, I hope, on achieving clean power by 2030, the first of the priorities Ed Miliband set out at the start of government. And so to focus on this, I'm joined by Alistair, I'm joined by Sophie, and I'm joined by Adam as well. And so Adam, if I could start with yourself for an introduction.
Yeah, sure. Hi everyone, I'm Adam Burnham, I'm Deputy Director at Energy UK.
Hi, I'm Sophie Lettier, Senior Policy Manager at Energy UK.
Hi everyone, I'm Alistair McKer, I look after Policy and Public Affairs at SSE.
Fantastic, yeah. And so as mentioned, 2030 is the target for achieving a fully decarbonised power system. It's a very significant, very ambitious plan, and a lot of the sort of copy in place to achieve this is around speeding up project delivery and overhauling the planning system and connections queue. And so if I am going to start with Adam yourself to give us a brief overview of the key rapid power decarbonisation asks in Energy UK's Mission Possible documentation.
Yeah, of course. So I mean, look, 2030 is an incredibly ambitious target. Let's not just underestimate how ambitious it is. Previous government had 2035, we're bringing it forward 5 years. In practical terms, that really means over one parliament we're hoping to achieve this. And it is a really stretching target, but I think as an energy sector, we've got used to not just meeting targets, but sometimes actually going beyond targets. If you look at things like renewables projections over the last few years, if you told me 5 or 10 years ago that the UK would have not just the biggest offshore wind farm in the world, but 3 of the 5 biggest offshore wind farms in the world, I probably wouldn't have believed you. And so I think there's something to be said for setting that type of ambitious target and having government and industry work hand in hand to try and meet it. But it does mean a few things that are going to require a step change, frankly, over the next few years. And the first one is procuring a really significant amount of homegrown clean energy. Now, it's going to come from lots of different sources, but renewables are likely to play the kind of the key role in that. And it's going to mean absolutely maxing out what we can through the kind of renewables auction schemes that we have. It's going to mean getting every single piece of low carbon energy we can on the ground and producing for 2030. It's also going to mean that we completely overhaul our planning system. We've seen some really positive things from the new government, including the end of the onshore wind ban in England, but there's much further to go. Fundamentally, planning, albeit with that small change, still remains vastly too slow to be able to achieve the scale of progress that the government's looking for by 2030. And then grid as well, as you rightly said, we need to be able to build the network infrastructure that underpins that, to be able to bring electricity from where it's produced to the homes and businesses around the country. Again, it is, I'm afraid, not moving fast enough, and there is a lot to be done there. You know, at the very least, implementing the reforms that were kind of envisaged by the previous parliament. There was a big report done. That is kind of the minimum of what we're looking at now to be able to get close to 2030. So there is a long way to go there. But I think the bigger thing I'd say is there is a target. In some ways, it is an arbitrary target. Often with these government targets, that you will pick a rounded number and you will aim for it. That's fine. But I think equally important as reaching 2030 is setting up a sustainable decarbonised power sector for after 2030. I think as Chris Stark, who's now running the mission control in the Department of Energy Security Net Zero, that is going to run this 2030 mission, said, the decarbonisation of the power sector is the gateway to the decarbonisation of the whole economy in the UK. And when you look out into the 2030s and 2040s, and particularly by the time we've reached 2050, the power sector is the energy sector. There's not much that isn't driven by the power sector. There's not much that isn't electrified. So this isn't just about reaching a specific target. This is about setting up the entire country for reaching net zero.
Sounds great. And you mentioned around how in some areas the speed of uptake has been different to what's been thought. You mentioned around offshore wind. What's worked in the past to get us where we are now? And how do you feel the new government has approached really speeding up, as you say, those ambitions?
Well, I think we've seen really good signs because the basis for all this, given that the building is all going to happen from the private sector and 70% of the capital from net zero is going to come from the private sector, I think it's ensuring that we really, really do work closely together. So you look at something like the Offshore Wind Industry Council, for example, as a way in which industry generally was working hand in hand with government, not just to figure out what was possible, but pushing each other to figure out what they could do, both in terms of getting shovels in the ground, getting supply chain, getting British supply chain and jobs and training. There's a whole set of kind of interlinked activities that underpins putting a wind turbine in the ground or putting a solar panel in the ground. So I think that is where we can learn, and we are starting to see the signs of that. But ultimately, we're coming off a difficult couple of years, I think, to be really honest. We've seen some difficulties around things like previous kind of renewables auction rounds. We've seen difficulties with increases in supply chain costs. That's going to take some grappling with by this government, and there is lots that we can learn, but we also have to implement really, really quickly. Because when we're thinking about 2030, I think you could look at it and think, well, that's 5 years. It's quite a long time. Let's just stay on the offshore wind because we're on a theme here. Takes 4 to 5 years lead time for an offshore wind project. Once you've got final investment decision, you've got your kind of contract for difference, which is your revenue support mechanism. You can't just magic that up in 2029 because we're not doing well enough. So that doesn't go for every single piece of renewables technology. For the onshore stuff, you can get it built a lot quicker. But nonetheless, I think it remains that we've really got 12 to 18 months to make this goal possible and to make this mission doable. But if we don't move quickly enough, and if we don't learn those lessons, it's going to be really hard to catch up in the latter part of the decade.
No, sounds really good. Thank you. And then I can imagine the government's interest is huge right now, but in the sort of documentation also Energy UK's published, you've got some focuses and sort of metrics there. And just from then bringing it out to the perspective of the developer of these projects, how have you found the start of this new government, and what thoughts do you have going forward into the future as well?
So thanks, Andy. I suppose first off, just to answer that question directly, clearly the government has come out rapidly out of the blocks, kind of made some big early decisions on some important things. So clearly the kind of allocation round 6 for the CFD, so AR6, that's kind of been kind of changed from what the kind of initial budget was earlier in the year, and it's gone big on actually the offshore wind component, the onshore renewables part, and actually also on floating offshore wind. That's a kind of big signal of ambition, but there's been a lot of the kind of the technical changes which they've made. So actually changes to kind of onshore planning, the planning regime and resourcing. They've kind of moved very quickly on that. Kind of removing the kind of effective ban on onshore wind in England. That's obviously a big statement, and hopefully she can lead some projects in England coming forward. But actually there's probably a few material things that are in that are kind of quite important in respect of 2030, because clearly all these elements are important, but actually what are the things that are going to be the kind of key cornerstones of kind of delivery of the 2030 ambition. So firstly, I'd probably say the offshore wind uplift in the AR6 change is ultimately critical. Offshore wind will be the cornerstone of the net zero kind of delivery and also the clean power mission. So kind of getting going on that after a disappointing auction last year has been really, really important. But actually, what are government going to do for AR7? What are they going to do for AR8? Those are questions they're going to need to answer fairly early if they want to kind of give that confidence through to the developers in the supply chain. And then there's a whole bunch of things you can do within the CFD to think about how you might reduce the overall headline costs. So do you actually go for longer CFDs? Transmission network charging kind of factors into CFDs and inflates kind of the cost of CFDs, and similarly kind of a process called REMA, which we'll kind of come back to, is inflating kind of the cost because it's kind of adding uncertainty to what the future of the energy system is going to look like. So all of these will factor into CFDs. So that first one of moving on to CFDs for offshore wind is a kind of big material change. But the other one that maybe doesn't get as much coverage is actually the planning and infrastructure bill. The reason why that's actually quite important is because there's a whole bunch of recommendations from the Windsor review. So that was the kind of UK electricity network champion that kind of did a review last year looking at what actions could be taken to accelerate grid delivery. There's a whole bunch of planning issues that kind of need to be kind of thought about within that. And actually, that's going to be the red risk for delivering, kind of grid build out to 2030 is, can it get through the planning system? So if we're not able to build out the grid because we're getting stuck in a quagmire of kind of planning cycles and public objections, etc. Basically, that's kind of the clean power mission not possible from kind of the first hurdle.
Right.
So the kind of when the kind of planning and infrastructure bill gets laid, how quickly it goes through Parliament, and actually does it include all the elements it needs to. That's probably a bit under the horizon. It's probably an early move that actually government's taken the right early steps on in terms of it being in the kind of King's speech, but the kind of, as most of these things, the kind of devil will be in the detail.
Sounds good. And then it's funny how time flies. I know at last year's Energy UK annual conference, Nick Windsor was there talking about his report, and we're at the point at the time now where the next Energy UK annual conference is soon. Just as well around, so we've talked a bit about offshore wind, and so just from my understanding as well as anyone's, NZIP. What does NZIP stand for, and why is it important in the way we're planning and building renewable energy?
Straight into the depths of planning policy. So nationally significant infrastructure projects regime.
Yeah.
So effectively, if you're in the NZIP regime, you're effectively kind of get a decision made by the kind of relevant Secretary of State, and so that's really important for projects that are, as the name suggests, national significance, of which many in the energy system are. So it's not just the wind farms, but it's the network connections that kind of bring them all up. So the kind of change, and apologies if I get this slightly wrong, because I'm very much a generalist, but actually the change they've made there is actually kind of how do they kind of allow kind of onshore wind decisions to be made by the Secretary of State rather than local planning authorities, which ends up getting kind of a much more difficult process and getting kind of community consent.
Mm-hmm.
But I think maybe through all of this, then it does need to be a kind of recognition that this is just not infrastructure that's imposed upon communities. Mm-hmm. That there is actually a kind of constructive relationship with the communities that are going to be hosting this infrastructure, mm-hmm. and there is a kind of shared kind of mutual benefit. I mean, a lot of that will be from the kind of economic opportunities that come from that, but actually, what are the community benefits that come through, both from the wind farms, but also the networks. Yeah. But actually, how do we make sure that any infrastructure delivery that is deployed is actually genuinely additive to the natural environment? Kind of making sure it's kind of net positive, and biodiversity is going to be very, very important going forward, and making sure that actually all of the policy and regulatory frameworks that we have allow that to happen, rather than actually, in the aspiration of competition, effectively driving things down to kind of lowest cost, but actually not capturing all the wider value that you might want to get from the infrastructure deployment, and importantly, not getting that kind of community buy-in for not only the infrastructure, but also the wider energy transition.
Very true, yeah, bringing everyone with us on the way. And then we touched on onshore and offshore wind. Other renewables are out there, have to be balanced. And if I could come to yourself, Sophie, and Adam as well. So you've mentioned, Adam, in your opening remarks there, that we're going to need a massive uptake of more renewables. And do you feel that current structures that the government have put in place, but also not just that announced, do we feel that fits the bill towards our 2030 targets, or do you think changes or different approaches need to be considered?
So I'll jump in. So I think what we've seen from the government for the last few weeks is a really welcome step change in the level of ambition. Obviously, we've got earlier target, more ambitious targets, but you need to sort of follow that target up with action, because it's sort of great to say let's have a plan, but we need to make sure that we have the mechanisms that will deliver on that plan. And so the main mechanism that's going to deliver 2030 is the contract for difference scheme. Yeah. That's the government's sort of main tool it has at its disposal, so we just need to make sure it's working really, really well. And Alistair touched on this a little bit, but in our Mission Possible report, where we're essentially recommending to government these are the things you should do now in the short term to realise that mission, is ensuring that the allocation rounds deliver as much capacity as possible, but then ensuring that the allocation round framework is working as effectively as possible. Right. So it's been really positive to see the government listen to industry, work with us, and sort of course correct for what happened with the under delivery of the previous auction round last year, where no new offshore wind projects came forward. So we saw a budget uplift that was announced recently that was very welcome. Absolutely that ambition should be welcome, but the ambition and the objective is still it's really large, and got written down here, we need to build around 3.5 times the current capacity we have, and to meet in the next 5 years, that's absolutely huge. And I think when you're faced with these big challenges, sometimes it can be a bit of a reaction to think about, okay, well, what are radical solutions we can implement? And despite, what happened last year, I think we also need to recognise that the CFD system has worked really, really well. Investors like it. It's delivered a lot of capacity, and Adam mentioned that we've become leaders in offshore wind. And so then now it's really about making sure that we align the CFD scheme with the government's ambition for 2030. And the way that you could do that is implementing a few sort of relatively straightforward but high impact reforms for future auction rounds to avoid the kind of budget uplift that we saw for AR6. Because really AR6 and AR7 are going to be the allocation rounds that deliver on 2030. So as Adam said, it's really critical that we get things right in the next 12 to 18 months.
As you said, 4 to 5 years you mentioned it takes to build, and so that 6 years takes us to 2030. And then just on coming back to the tagline, if you will, clean power by 2030, Adam, it'd be interesting to hear, I guess, taking that definition of clean power, what does that actually mean? And then what do you think the key performance indicators are going to be or could be to keep the government to account for clean power?
Yes, very good question. I mean, it's unclear what it means at the moment. I think if you talk to various kind of political figures prior to the election, you would have had maybe slightly different framing as to what that end goal looks like. But clearly, we need to reach a point at which there is a clearly defined outcome, and so you can evaluate success of that target. And I think the government, it's going to be one of the early tasks of this government to figure out exactly what success looks like. Even just basic things like, is it the 1st of January 2030? Is it the end of December 2030? You're giving yourself an extra year if that's the case. So there are big things to be worked out.
I think in the energy space, you're actually probably moving into is it March of the financial year? When you're kind of talking about delivery windows and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, of course. There's various ways in which you could define it, right? And the easiest way is to go back to what the previous government said, what they had as their target, which was a decarbonised power sector by 2035 with a big old comma afterwards, followed by subject to security of supply. What this meant was they'll go as far as they can, but they recognise there's still going to be some gas probably left in the system, either for a few hours here or there, or a few weeks here or there. Depends on how far you got, how expensive it is, etc. For 2030 clean power, you could choose a similar sort of definition, and you could say a decarbonised power system. It's a bit fluffy, and it kind of allows you to, as you say, to push as far as you can, but without necessarily having to reach a formal kind of numerical target. So that's one possibility. You could aim for a net zero power sector by 2030, and that means you've essentially got some remaining emissions in the system, but they are offset by some sort of removals technology. I think in the power sector, really, there's only one game in town if it comes to whether you could achieve that by 2030, and that's biomass with carbon capture and storage. It's hard to imagine of another technology that could fill that kind of hole within the next 5 years. You could also look at a carbon intensity target. The Climate Change Committee have talked about carbon intensity targets for various different technologies. Or you could choose a number. You could say, I want to get rid of 90% of the emissions, 95% of the emissions, 100% of the emissions. The thing I think, from an industry perspective, we always feel about some of those numerical targets is that particularly if you're looking at 95, 98, 100%, it's hard. It's hard. And the reason that it's hard is that anyone approaching climate change as an economic challenge tries to mitigate, tries to deal with the emissions that are cheapest first. And you work your way up with what we would call the marginal cost abatement curve, which is essentially you go to the cheapest emissions first, and then those emissions become more expensive over time. You get rid of more of them, and then by the end you're dealing with the most expensive emissions. If you were to choose, say, 100% target, what you're doing is going from here to here immediately. And you're missing out all of this cheaper emissions abatement, which you could get in a whole bunch of other sectors, which would be much more constructive in actually reaching our carbon budget targets. So I think there is a question of whether that's fundamentally plausible, because I struggle to see any government looking at that final percentage point or two and looking at the cost and thinking, does that represent good value to consumers?
Yes. Well, it's case in point in your reports, you've mentioned that removing that last 0.5% of emissions from electricity generation could cost £1,600 per tonne. So yeah, it's a real sharp upward curve to look at those final.
It's a really, really big increase. Yeah. And I think actually you can have all these definitions, and I hope there will be a formal definition at some point. But I think at the end of the day, what we come back to as an industry is, if you look at something like the child poverty targets under the 97 Labour government, they set those targets, they didn't reach them, but they got 4/5 of the way there. And they got 4/5 of the way there because they set the target. Does anyone look back and say, oh, well, because you didn't get 100% of the way there, we're going to begrudge everything you did on child poverty? No, of course not. And the families that had their lives improved as a result, I'm sure wouldn't say that. So when it comes to clean power by 2030, what we're behind as an industry is a real step change and a rapid decarbonisation of the power sector and a rapid increase in clean homegrown energy. That is the objective.
Maybe just come in now. So I think you're right, obviously, to couch in terms of, there's obviously the climate imperative to going faster, but actually the kind of the reframing of the debate around actually why are we going faster? Climate change is obviously there, but kind of there's a big economic opportunity coming forward. Actually putting the UK back at the top of the clean energy race. We've heard a lot about the US in the kind of past kind of couple of years with the kind of Inflation Reduction Act. The EU obviously kind of progressed with their kind of Green Deal and Fit for 55 and a whole bunch of stuff there. But actually, I think they kind of, if you're kind of talking the language of the government at the moment, obviously clearly jobs is important, but we've just gone through a period where we've had kind of severe damage to the economy done by kind of an international energy crisis. Basically, we were kind of heavily dependent on imported fossil fuels. That alone kind of cost taxpayers between kind of 22 and 24, so over that 2-year period, £75 billion, just taxpayers alone and energy bill support. If you kind of factor in what the kind of additional cost to domestic consumers, add 50 billion to that. And that's even before you start to think about the impact of the kind of real world economy. And there'll be kind of damage that's done by the energy crisis to the kind of real people's lives, real economy, real jobs, real businesses that are not coming back. And so how do we make sure that we really drive this forward so that we can actually protect the economy against these future kind of international commodity price risks and capture a hell of a lot of value as we do it? That's the rationale for driving forward. It's not just a case of we're doing this because we want to feel nice about ourselves because we're kind of solving climate change. That's great. But actually, there's an economic imperative to do it, and there's a big economic opportunity.
Yeah, very true. And talking about those economic opportunities, if I come to you next, Sophie, around energy flexibility. So I guess energy flexibility has always been there in the way that we can flex up and down generation of large generators, transmission connected generators, but we're seeing now an increase in participation at lower voltage levels for flexibility and flexibility from both the demand side and the generation side. But focusing a little bit on the role of gas generation and generation in general, what role do you see them playing in 2030, and do you see it changing in terms of how much flexibility they'll provide or where they'll provide it?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think if I just come back to Alice's point quickly about sort of why we need rapid power sector decarbonisation, and it is about energy security. We recently published an analysis that looked at sort of the bill savings, but also the carbon savings that you could have had from more ambitious CFD auction rounds. And can't remember the details off the top of my head, but I think that's really why going faster is really important, is so that you have that kind of more secure energy system delivered more quickly, and that benefits consumers as well. And protects them, the CFDs can provide certain price stability, and that protects them from future international shocks like the ones we saw recently. I think, we need to talk about gas. Gas is still a really significant part of our energy mix, even though renewables provide the majority of electricity generation. Gas is still the largest single source, and it provides most of our flexibility at the moment. And so when we're thinking about a renewables-based electricity system, we need to think about security of supply and the changing nature of security of supply and system stress events in the future. So it's likely that as the system changes, as we have a higher penetration of intermittent renewables, we're going to see longer periods of time with potentially less wind, less sun, things like that. So we really need that infrastructure in place to provide the flexibility, which is not currently being provided by gas.
You hear is it Dunkelfields or
Dunkelfields,
Duncanfields? Yeah. So it's like,
I've actually said it because I didn't want to be the first one. But yeah, so I think, as Adam mentioned, like getting that final bit of gas off the system is going to be, it's sort of, it becomes more expensive the lower down that you do it. And when you're thinking about the previous government's targets, so the 2035 net zero targets, which are subject to security of supply, when the Climate Change Committee was looking at how you deliver that, they still saw a role for gas within that system. So I think it was about 2% of generation. And so I think within 2030, we don't really know yet what gas will be like at that point. I think how we will know how we make progress is just ensuring that the technologies that can provide flexibility, dispatchable generation are in place. And at the moment, I think there's a long way to go. There's still some uncertainty about the future of long duration energy storage, about hydrogen to power, about CCUS. We're at a phase now where we really need a lot of clarity and certainty from government. There is some ambition, but it's sort of these technologies really need to get off the ground. And so one thing I want to mention, which was in our report, is about the CCUS decisions that the government needs to make, and that's really important. We're awaiting final investment decision for Track 1 projects, and that's a decision that government needs to make by September. So that's going to be really critical to maintain investor confidence in the sector and ensure that the UK can really take the lead on this. There's a lot of opportunities, not just in terms of reducing carbon emissions, but also those investment decisions could bring in 30 billion of private sector investment according to the CCSA.
Wow, yeah.
That could create 70,000 new jobs, but also secure 77,000 new jobs, I think the CCSA said, in current high carbon industries. So I think it's just about the government providing certainty and signals to invest in the technologies that will replace gas. And then so once you develop that mix, there's no single solution that can help replace the flexibility that gas provides. You need everything, everything everywhere all at once. So it's going to be a combination, and it's just important that we see that clarity in the direction of travel, and that government keeps the timeframes.
And just on the kind of percentage figure you kind of refer to on unabated gas, like whether it's 2%, 3%, 4%, 5%, ultimately I think we're, with a fair wind, apologies for the pun, but if you can kind of get to kind of 95% low carbon by 2030, that kind of gets you to about, potentially below 30 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, which is way less than what the kind of CCC were factoring in for the previous carbon budget. So there's definite progress there, but that kind of conceptually, that 5% or lower is like, how do you get it down to 0%? But even those levels, where maximum 5% of unabated gas in the power system, that still ends up with gas power stations operating the system half of the hours in the year. So there's a kind of difference between energy, which is actually the thing that matters, which is the kind of gas consumption and the kind of emissions that actually come from the power station, and this kind of form of capacity. So half the time of the year, we're going to require, a gas power station is going to be on the system, and that's before you start thinking about, are there any system balancing services that kind of may not be accounted for in modelling, or actually even just grid stability kind of services that need to be provided. So it's how do we kind of make sure that the kind of the firm dispatchable capacity is there, but actually how do we come back to this point on cost? How do we make sure that we kind of reduce emissions and gas consumption as much as we can, but be pragmatic about the costs? And so that's the existing part of the question on unabated gas. But actually, I think where an incoming government's going to have to think a bit more about is what's the new stuff that's coming forward. because we kind of now have got ourselves into a mindset where it's like unabated gas, power CCS, or hydrogen power. Whereas actually, those are going to have to start blurring into each other.
Okay.
So you're going to have to start having power CCS projects or hydrogen power projects that use unabated gas for a period at the kind of start. And there's often debate about retrofit, etc. But I think that's also quite a simplified discussion.
Right.
You're not going to. The way to think about gas power stations is kind of like iPhones, right? They're not really worth fixing. You buy a new one.
Okay.
And so the same is true for applying a power CCS or hydrogen, or kind of enabling a gas power station to use 100% of hydrogen.
Right.
You're going to have to build a new station. I mean, the exception to that rule is potentially CHP, where you kind of providing steam for heat. But you're basically going to need to build a new turbine, let's call it, that for the first part of its life, it will have to use unabated gas.
Right.
But at which point in time, where the CO2 infrastructure is then available, or the low carbon hydrogen supply is available, it then plugs in and switches over. But you need to engineer that at the start. And in a policy question, that's really, really difficult, because it's how do you transition from the capacity market and how do you then plug in the dispatchable power agreement? And I think there's a bit of a debate about which one it is, and there kind of needs to be a decision on that. But ultimately, it's where is that infrastructure going to be, and when is it going to be there?
Okay.
Yeah, and just that's a really good point. And I think when you're talking about the policy framework, it is hard to reflect, I think, the technological reality in terms of, for example, the financing mechanisms that we have for these technologies. So for the capacity market, there are still some questions around, what happens to a plant within its capacity agreement if it chooses to have an outage and retrofit, and then the policy framework hasn't really got an answer yet for, we've got some issues with the rules and regulations in the capacity market that don't allow for change in configuration of plant.
Right. Okay.
And so it's sort of these small but significant obstacles in how you get to a system where you're abating gas, or you're developing these plants where you have unabated gas at the start, and then either retrofitted with CCUS or hydrogen. We just need to make sure that the policy framework and the financing arrangements for that, so the support that plants get through the capacity market, reflect that reality.
That sounds great. Well, do you know what? It's completely covered all of the next question prompts, because I was going to talk to you a little bit about more of the different technologies that we could see on a future grid. And now that we've got this 2030 target, does anything need to change in the way that we either incentivize or disincentivize certain generation to be built? And does anything need to change or be different to achieve that?
Okay, I suppose maybe the big debate at the moment is kind of REMA, and there's kind of no definitive pathway through just on that we're kind of aware of. But maybe answer that question in kind of three parts. So I think the first part we'll kind of talk about the investment mechanisms that we know well, and then kind of secondly actually a move to strategic energy infrastructure planning, which has kind of crept up on us collectively, and we've kind of accidentally in some ways falling into something that's actually quite handy for delivering rapid decarbonisation of the electricity system. And then I'll kind of touch on REMA. So that first one, to answer the question directly, are the investment mechanisms going to be in place to deliver in 2030? Yes, basically. So we've got the CFD, we've got the capacity market, we've got the regulatory price controls for the networks. They're all there. They just need kind of tweaks to get the ambition right, as we've seen with the AR6 uplift. And then actually what about the business models or the investment frameworks for the new technologies that we need? Actually, they're in train. So cap and floor mechanism for long duration energy storage, so that will help deploy the hydro pump storage assets that kind of we need, and we've got a few of them and kind of that are ready to go. Shovel ready in political language. Also, the dispatchable power agreement that we've touched on already will be kind of critical for deployment of power CCS and hydrogen power generation. And then there's the whole kind of CCS cluster space, so the kind of track 1, track 2, track 1 extension language that kind of gets referred to. That's not directly related to the power system, but the power system will be very much dependent on, you can't run a power CCS project without a CO2 infrastructure to plug into. And obviously there'll be a whole bunch of other kind of sectors that are plugged into that. That kind of second point I kind of mentioned, strategic energy infrastructure planning, actually it's quite frankly, it's a bit of a gift for an incoming government. They kind of accidentally found themselves there. I mean, if we go through the history of the acronyms that are going to be coming forward, right? So in 2020, we started off with the Offshore Transmission Network Review because the then Prime Minister basically said we're going to go big on offshore wind, great, but we need to connect all this stuff. So how did we go about doing that? That was the Offshore Transmission Network Review in 2020, which then led on to something called the Holistic Network Design, or H&D, which basically then went, okay, here is our kind of plan for how we're going to connect up 40 gigawatts of offshore wind, note 40, it wasn't quite 50 at that point, and then that was kind of put in place. And then that led to something called the ASTI framework, so that was the kind of Accelerated Strategic Transmission Investment Framework.
Need a glossary somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. So if anyone needs them, I'm happy to email them all through. But that was kind of critical for going to the TOs, of which SSE has kind of joint ownership with SCN Transmission, which is a TO in the north of Scotland. Basically said, okay, these projects are approved, which is a massive step change from what it was before, where there was kind of needs case of, is there going to be some wind built in Scotland? The answer was yes. It was always yes. We could have answered that 10 years ago, but we've only kind of really grasped the nettle in 2022. And then in 2024, we had the next iteration of the H&D, which was the Beyond 2030 plans, which then captured the 50 gigawatts target and also ScotWind. So that's kind of in place. So it's kind of spring. Actually, that's kind of quite important, kind of in the context of how do you accelerate 2030 delivery as well. So how many parts of that need to be brought forward if you're looking at 2030? And actually, a load of this is going to be solidified and formalized and codified, or whatever the right kind of terminology for a group of different acronyms would be. But with kind of the centralized strategic network plan, so the CSNP, which will then operate with the regional energy strategic planners, RESPs, which then can go down into distribution network, which also then plug into the local area energy plans, so the LAEPs, and then you have the important one, the SSEP, which is the Strategic Spatial Energy Plan, which is going to bring it all together and actually going to be the fundamental delivery plan of the kind of infrastructure we need. And that's where the kind of 2030 outlook is going to have to plug in. And so there are kind of two things in the SSEP that are kind of particularly important. It's that, how do we accelerate the kind of transmission infrastructure we might need, the additional one we might need for 2030, and back to the CCS and hydrogen point, is where is this infrastructure going to be? So that's the second, sorry, it's a long-winded way, that was the second one. The third one is very, very short. So REMA. REMA is the Review of Electricity Market Arrangements to its friends and tormentors. But basically, we've kind of got stuck over the last 2 years in a debate about should we split the electricity market in GB into multiple zones. So effectively kind of regional pricing. And ultimately the argument comes down to operational efficiency versus investment impacts. And so from our perspective, clearly we're planning to do a lot of investment, we and others are, and basically making a radical reform at this point in time is just going to add to the cost of actually delivering on net zero. So in that sense, it's just, actually, and even practically from a kind of government position, their own analysis suggests that a kind of a cost of capital impact of 0.3 percentage points kind of impact on cost of capital and low carbon generation would effectively erode the potential benefits of moving towards zonal pricing. So to be quite frank, that sort of level of threshold should have had zonal pricing knocked out for this point. It might be something to consider for the future, but that ultimately should be off the table now. But the sorry, I kind of lost my kind of train of thought. But just that kind of political context, right? If you're thinking, made a promise to bring down bills in 2029, kind of undertaking a radical reform which has kind of runs against kind of the priorities for investment delivery, and then also kind of doesn't actually have any visible benefits to consumers. Whether ultimately whether the case is right or wrong, the visible benefits to consumers won't materialise until it's actually implemented, which is kind of into the 2030s. That does not work on the political timescales. Politicians are going to be thinking about 2029. How do I sell what I've done to the electorate so I can get back in? Kind of zonal pricing just doesn't fit, and that's before you kind of think about even the kind of debates that you probably have in the tabloids around postcode pricing, and we've seen a bit of that kind of covered already. But it just politically doesn't stand up. So, and practically the case for it doesn't stack up in our views either. So we're as SSE are calling for the government to make a decision on it. Basically, got the budget, an opportunity to make a big statement to global investors. They're kind of hosting a global investment summit around the same time. Actually resolving REMA, in our view, basically not going forward with zonal pricing and focusing on a reformed national market program of incremental measures that could actually deliver consumer benefits ahead of 2030 and allow all that investment to come forward would be a critical thing for the government to do. So very long-winded way of saying that, but hopefully handy.
No, it's great, and it's actually, it was great to sort of hear the acronym conga line almost of how they all fit together as well. I think it's acronyms that we sort of get used to in isolation, but having them all connected up, with what you've said is really useful. And before I move on to maybe a few other questions, positions on REMA or thoughts on REMA, anything to add there?
Look, this is a major reform programme, but it was a major reform programme kicked off by the last government. So, as with anything like this, there's a fundamental question as to what this new government's going to want to do with it. Are they going to take all of it? Are they going to strip it for parts? Are they going to completely bin it? I have no idea. There's a very large team working on it in government, so I hope that they at least take that team with them. I think as Alistair said, that there's a really, really hard trade-off because we do need to look at how to actually operate a decarbonised power system. And we need to do that really efficiently. But we need the investment coming in. And I think maybe the missing piece that we haven't spoken about so much, which kind of extends from REMA, is the demand side, which is... We talked a lot about big kit, big, shiny, wind turbines, or big kind of factories creating low carbon kit that politicians can cut a ribbon on. That's fantastic, but we also need to make sure that we're not overbuilding. Why would you produce any more renewables capacity than you need to? Why would you build any more grid than you need to? We don't want to add costs to consumers. And one of the best ways of doing that is addressing the demand side and ensuring that we can actually not just use less energy because the cheapest unit of energy is the one that's never used, obviously, but also use energy in a smarter way. I think that's one thing that REMA is trying to get to as well, but there's loads of moving parts on that because it's about, the smart meter program. You need to make sure every home that's going to be able to do this, going to be able to shift their load maybe from one time to another, has a smart meter in place. And we've had a really successful program, which is kind of the prototype of what this might look like, called the Demand Flexibility Scheme, over the last couple of years, which was developed because of the energy crisis. And at the heart of the energy crisis, the electricity system operator thinking, oh my God, I'm not sure we're quite going to be able to provide enough energy at some particular times of day. So can we get people to shift when they put their washing machine on, when they do their cooking? Not everyone's going to be able to do that, but you don't need everyone to do it. You just need a small proportion of that to shift the load. And in some cases, it can be really, really big. And particularly as we're moving to more low carbon tech in homes, from electric vehicles where you can do this kind of bidirectional charging, this vehicle to grid charging, so you're actually taking energy from your EV and putting it back into the grid, often just for short periods of time. You've got a heat pump as well that you can, as we see heat pumps ramping up to the 600,000 installations per year that the government is aiming towards. That's a pretty big number. Heat pumps, you can turn them on at different times of day to make sure that you're actually making the most of electricity when it's cheapest, when it's most abundant. And I think for me, that's the big thing that is coming out of REMA is, yes, we need to make sure that we've got everything right in terms of the key investment cases for things like renewables through the CFD, the capacity market for kind of smaller, low carbon flexibility as well. But there is this huge, possible bill reduction that could come from the demand side that it feels like is the kind of forgotten cousin of the sexier renewables. And that's great. It's an and, not an or. You can't do either. But if we want to reach 2030 at lowest cost, and if we want to achieve net zero at lowest cost, it's about using what we have in a really, really smart way. And at the moment, we just don't have the market mechanisms for that. And it's not necessarily the national market mechanisms. It's often really nitty-gritty things about how the balancing mechanism works and what's allowed in, and the capacity mechanism as well. So those are the types of things I'd like to see some changes on over the coming kind of 18 to 24 months, because that's the type of thing that will allow you to build less in order to achieve 2030.
Understood, yeah. And I guess the next...
I was just actually going to come in that, because see, we are a deployer of infrastructure. So I appreciate the kind of, I will say that, it will kind of come back at me. But I kind of think just if we kind of play back how we've got to where we are, right? And so I completely agree that you want to unlock the demand side if you're going to reduce costs. That's critically important. But we spent the last 10 to 15 years of what I've been in the sector talking about least regret options, and actually, and it kind of gets into this point of basically we've waited and see. We've built a load of wind where we know it's like seabed has been leased. It was leased many years ago for the projects that are being deployed now. Didn't build grid. Okay, didn't deploy the low carbon flexibility. It fundamentally comes down to this, or something else might come along. Something else might be better. And I think actually with the Clean Power Mission, we really need to be careful. Like, yes, unlock flexibility, but it can't be like, maybe we don't need so much grid. Maybe we don't need so much more capacity. We need everything. It needs to go in the ground. Beyond that period, yes, let's have a debate about actually what the energy system looks like. But the next 10 years, we know what needs to get built, and if we really want to kind of get it lower cost, and we want to capture those economic opportunities that come with it, we just got to kind of put some stakes in the ground and get on with doing it.
Get on with it, yeah. So if I could potentially move us to the Q&A now, so we've got some great questions from those watching. So the first question I'm going to ask, maybe for yourselves, is at GK, is that if you could copy a policy that another country's enacted to enable decarbonisation, what would you pick? This feels like a very, pick and mix. What would, if you could wave a magic wand, what would you copy and paste?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I'm going to turn that on its head, if that's all right, because I think that's the easier way to answer it, and it's maybe a slightly political way of answering this as well. There's lots we can learn from other countries, and I think one of the critical things is, if you look at our carbon budgets and we go beyond just the power sector, we are nowhere near far enough advanced in terms of sectors like road transport and buildings. Power sector is going to play a huge role in decarbonising those. And there's lots we can learn from other countries and how to do that. How can we do heat pump installations or network heating? There's so much we can learn from other countries. But sometimes there's a sense that because something has been done elsewhere, and maybe it's been successful for a while, maybe slightly less so more recently, that we should take it and it is by default better, and it will by default work in the UK. And I think an interesting example of this at the moment, where there's a really lively debate, is around some possible changes to offshore wind, where we are seeing some kind of early stage moves from the government, thinking about, should we quite fundamentally change the process, the structure, the timeline of how development is done in relation to offshore wind. At the moment, it is a process that's too long. A lot of that fundamentally is about the planning system, it's about not having the grid capacity, etc. But we're seeing these moves to consider something closer to maybe the Dutch model, where, for example, things like the planning and early stage development, planning, permitting, possibly grid connection, are basically done by the state to some degree, and then that is kind of sold on to developers at that point. Now, that has worked well in the Netherlands, although recently they've really struggled to get bids in, so it's kind of hard to say that system is working as well as they would like it to in the Netherlands. But at the moment, the state doesn't perform any of those functions in the UK. There's not a single civil servant anywhere around the country who knows how to fill in the planning application. The developers do. They do it day in, day out. They have big teams that underpin offshore wind projects. They have massive expenditure that goes in way before FID is ever reached. And so we do just need to be cautious that when we're looking at exemplars from other countries, we also think, how will this work in the UK? And particularly when we're looking at something like a 2030 target. So we've heard kind of questions about the role that GB Energy could play in relation to this, maybe in tandem with the Crown Estate. One organisation doesn't currently exist. The other organisation doesn't have anyone that does this at the moment. So that's fine. They can staff up. They can learn that. I don't know whether they can necessarily do it better or cheaper than the private sector, but let's just say that they can. It's going to take a while. And I think, to Alice's point, the last thing that we need at the moment is uncertainty, because there is so much to do and there is so much to build over the next few years. So yes, there's a lot to learn from other countries, but we've also got to be cautious, because lots of countries look to us to measures of success. The CFD programme has been an incredibly successful measure. And when, for example, the European Commission was looking at how to reform their electricity market kind of during the energy crisis, What did they do? They basically copied our last set of major reforms, the electricity market reform. They looked at the capacity market. They looked at CFDs. They looked at our power purchase agreement market, which is actually one of the most mature in Europe. We have lots of ways in which we can also pass on what we've done to the world. So obviously it goes both ways, but let's just recognise that in every different country there is a different context, a different set of circumstances. And just because something works in another country doesn't always mean it's going to work in the UK.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, just on that, the kind of actually environmental assessments is kind of the one that's probably the area where the GB Energy Crown Estate tie-up can actually quite help. At the moment, each individual wind farm does its own environmental assessment, and ultimately the impacts of this infrastructure will be cumulative. And so you go, okay, well, you know, what the impact's going to be on the kind of ecosystem. One individual developer can't look at that in the round, and it can't kind of go, okay, there's a future wind farm coming here and a future wind farm coming here. So actually having, you know, seabed leasing going, okay, this is the infrastructure that's going to be in the location that we've said it's going to be. We're going to kind of undertake the environmental assessments. We're going to make sure that kind of any strategic compensation is in place that actually helps get the projects through planning. And that's how you can kind of, you know, Adam referred to, you know, the large expense that we put into development projects, that can be squeezed, both in terms of time and cost. You know, Berwick Bank is a kind of 4.1 gigawatt wind farm that we're developing up in Scotland. If built, it would be the kind of largest in the world. It's currently been in the planning system, I think, 20 months and counting. And it's largely around kind of environmental assessments because it is tricky, you know, for the kind of the relevant planning authority, which is the Scottish Government, to kind of think about these kind of considerations in the round. How does it engage with kind of similar environmental regulators in England, but also across the North Sea? There are some benefits that can come out of that. And I think the Dutch model, as we kind of maybe call it, I think there are opportunities to speed things up, reduce costs, make things a little bit better. But I think Adam's right that we kind of do need to think about this it's the context of which we're already in. It's not a blank sheet of paper. Actually, how do we take things and make things, you know, improve things and move things faster and quicker? And ultimately, faster and quicker, you know, it's not just good outcome, it's cost.
Yeah.
You know, it's a bunch of people working on a project for a very long time that, quite frankly, don't need to be working that period of time. They could be moving on to the next project.
Right.
But no, they're basically assessing the same project again and again and again and chasing paper around. So there's definitely some improvements.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, and priority 5 within Energy UK's Mission Possible podcast series is around EU-UK relationships. I'm sure we'll get to the copy and paste side there and look forward to hearing more. Magic Wand, what would you, what would you sort of like to change?
Well, I think I sort of agree with Alistair and Adam, what they said so far on this. I think the only thing I would add is actually maybe not answering that question directly. It's just to say, I don't think we're short of any good ideas. I think if you look at the last month, to kind of match the new government's ambition, there's been a lot of reports being published. And so with, you know, recommendations on how you can deliver 2030. And so I think it's quite important to be like, let's not reinvent the wheel here, but we've got a system that has worked quite well, especially with CFDs. You know, we've been leaders in this technology. The CFD is now being, it's really a sign of our global leadership on action on climate change. And we've also done really well at reducing our carbon emissions. So I think given the short time frame that we have to work with, there's lots of things that could be done, and we really need to focus on removing the barriers.
Right, okay.
So yeah, which I think is sort of what we've talked about today.
Yeah, no, sounds great. And then the next question I've got is around homegrown power as a phrase, and the government has been quite quick to set up GB Energy. There's also Great British Nuclear. There is quite a lot of focus on, well, 2 words of those 3 are Great Britain, so Great British. So what are your thoughts on how to build this decarbonised clean power network by 2030 and deliver that, and where the supply chain is, where skills need to be developed? Yeah, where do you feel the sort of priorities and focuses need to be to sort of realise this idea of Great British power? Because there's obviously quite a lot of companies and equipment that come and invest in the UK, and how do you ensure that return on investment, you know, is within Great Britain and sort of fulfilling obligations that government have elsewhere as well?
Yeah, that's
big question.
One.
Yeah,
that's a tough one. Well, I mean, in terms of how does the investment end up in the UK, what I'd say is it ends up in terms of lower prices, and it ends up in terms of the benefits of a predominantly renewable energy system, and it ends up in insulating us from the billions and billions and billions that we spent during the energy crisis, which we do not have the money to spend again. We don't have the money for another a gas crisis caused by an invasion of a country around which we have almost no agency. So we do not set prices when it comes to fossil fuels, although we have them in the ground. We give them to companies to do with as they like. So it is ultimately very, very hard to say that homegrown clean energy is anything other than the mechanism to ensure that we have energy security, to ensure we can be insulated from global events. So I think in terms of money, that's the kind of primary thing. Yeah, there's a long way to go in terms of supply chains. There's a long way to go in terms of skills and jobs more broadly. I think we are waiting to see how this government develops their industrial strategy and the kind of role that clean energy plays in that, because we've seen little bits. So, for example, the National Wealth Fund has some money that may go to ports. That's fantastic, and that's in relation to particularly things like wind. Wind turbines being imported into the UK or exported as well, where we have very, very little port capacity. So that's really positive, but at every single stage of the process of the supply chain and of the jobs, there are opportunities for the UK, and we've seen from this government, I'm not sure we've actually seen it yet, but in the manifesto they talked about the British Jobs Bonus, which I think we've read to be a kind of slight change to what's already in place in the Contracts for Difference programme, through the Sustainable Industry Rewards Scheme, I think is the name for it, so ensuring more local content, local jobs, etc. That's really great. At the end of the day, there's lots of technologies we can talk about, from wind turbines to heat pumps to EVs that underpin the kind of green economy. We're not going to domesticate every single supply chain. We're not going to domesticate and reshore every single job for all of these industries, nor should we. That would be a ludicrous approach. What we need to understand from this government is where do they think the real strategic priorities are in relation to these different areas of the green economy? Because I think what we've seen over recent years is kind of ad hoc investments into, an EV factory there, a battery factory over here, maybe one turbine manufacturer. That's fine, but if we're going to make a real strategic play for something, because we know we're going to make a long-term investment in it, there are long-term jobs and certainty, we need to be able to have a strategy that underpins that. And I think, as a good example of that, both of us were down at Hinckley the other day, down in the West Country. Major civil engineering projects happening in Europe at the moment. And I think what's so striking about what the nuclear industry does is that it guarantees an industry for life. And I think that's something we should really all aspire to across multiple different technologies, is guaranteeing the trajectory for people, for jobs and skills, for life. And what you get out of that is people that are incredibly passionate about the work they do. And, we do have that to some degree across different low carbon technologies, but I think, we do need to work towards a much more integrated process in which we can actually say, okay, we're building this much offshore wind, we're building this much onshore wind and solar for 2030. How do we actually ensure that we're getting people through technical colleges at the right point, that we're having the right accreditations and skills through apprenticeships? How can we make sure that we're getting the supply chain in, and for the bits where we can really make a difference, that we're producing them? We're not there yet. It's fine. We're a month into the new government. I don't think anyone would say that we should have been there yet. But it is something that we really, really hope the government's going to be working on over the coming months.
Okay, and are there any closing remarks from yourself before we close as well? Any thoughts or any
closing remarks? I suppose the kind of GB Energy point, I think, is probably the kind of slight element of your question we didn't touch upon. But there's a whole bunch of things it can do, and welcome it kind of helping to accelerate the transition. I think, actually, how can it help secure a floating offshore wind supply chain will be an important point, which comes back to the port infrastructure. But actually, there's probably some things it can do in actually helping an area that kind of UKPN are obviously interested in as well, is kind of how do you actually support flexibility which can kind of be brought into the distribution network to help a bunch of these new demands connecting to the system, be them housing projects or data centers, etc. There's a whole bunch of things that need to be going on at the distribution level that maybe the local power plan can help to deliver with as well.
Yeah, sounds great. Well, no, this has been a fantastic discussion around clean power for 2030. I'd like to thank Adam, Sophie, Alistair. And we'll close there, and I'll close with thanking you all for joining as well. There are two things which I've been asked to tell dear viewers. You can register for the second episode of this podcast series, which will focus on delivering affordable energy bills in a sustainable retail market. That's going to take place next Wednesday at 12 noon till 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And also, I mentioned it before, but Energy UK's annual conference is upcoming. It will be on Tuesday, 17th of September. So yeah, you can find information on how to register for that on Energy UK's website. So we'll close there, and thank you very much for joining. And thank you all.
Cheers.
Thanks, Andy.
Thank you.